I'm Lacey Bresky. Today I'm joined by my friends and fellow international affairs colleagues, Drew Casey.
Hey.
Grace Chesson.
Hello.
And Kevin Ferdosi.
Hello.
Today we're going to be talking about Rwanda and the contentious debate surrounding President Paul Kagame's leadership since the small East African country emerged from the horrific genocide of 1994. The latest forefront of African economic growth is stable, but has some serious constraints on democratic freedoms. To start, let's go back and look at what happened since the Rwandan genocide in Rwanda. I feel like a lot of people aren't necessarily familiar with what's going on.
Sure. So I'll go ahead and jump in here from the beginning.
Great.
So you have Rwanda emerging from this horrific genocide, as you say, in 1994, which left about 800,000 to 1 million people dead. And it really fractured the country, as you can imagine. And structurally, and looking at the government, it really gave Paul Kagame the opportunity to shape the government and have more centralized control. You see elections as a really volatile time in a country's development and just, democratic governance and development in general. And so you have Paul Kagame being able to come in as kind of a strong man and be seen as a guarantor of post-genocide stability. And then going along with that, I mean, the country has seen incredible economic growth that has really solidified his role there. Looking at the structure of the government, the opposition party is also fractured. And so there are a lot of different variables that go into the situation here where it makes the situation ripe for centralized control. The powers of the president in terms of being able to, who he's able to appoint within the government and his role in parliament really sets up a structure where the president has a legitimate dominant authority of the national government.
So you bring up an interesting little dichotomy between democracy and development, and we sort of look at which one comes first, and what are we seeing, or what will we see, and this is to the group, with Rwanda being used as perhaps a template because we've seen such strong economic growth, but there are problems with democracy in the country.
Well, this is a big theoretical debate when you're looking at international development. You have on one side this democratic governance camp, which really sees the importance of democracy and of civil liberties in promoting development afterwards. And then you have the other side, the developmental state camp, that sees the key to economic growth as centralized decision making. And so I think if we take it from the theoretical debate to the practical side, we really see Rwanda as a case study for this theory. So you also see this with a lot of other countries, a lot of Asian countries. And Drew, I think you were trying to jump in here.
I want to interject to ask. So I think this is the balance though between those two models that you mentioned earlier. You call them the democratic governance model and the developmental model. So the democratic governance model would suggest, and this is I guess a stereotype, but the democratic pro-democratic model would have as widespread, as early inset, as deeply implemented democracy in as many places as possible, no matter what, right, without exception. And then everything should drive toward that immediately. And it's maybe sort of a democracy first model, right? But then you have the developmental model, which would suggest that you need to develop like social, political, and even real physical infrastructures in place before you can even begin to think about building a democratic society. So these are both interesting. And I wonder if they each might work better in different places, depending on the history and the social reality on the ground in those places. But then also, if you look at the developmental model, so for example, as we continue to talk about Rwanda today, like what are the costs, though, of this sort of strongman centralized government that is able to marshal resources much easier than a democratic system can to develop the country so that it has the infrastructure necessary to eventually develop a more healthy democracy? What are the costs to that?
The costs for him to push back on political liberalization are low. So you have the situation here where, especially in the past decade, the Rwandan economy has emerged very strongly, not just internally, but also how accessible it is to the international community. So you have international actors that are now looking to invest more heavily in the country and have a vested interest likewise. So that cost is low, and you see the international community is, for the most part, on his side. Kagame was here in D.C. visiting with Obama in the 2014 U.S. Africa Leaders Summit, and, is being shown as, in good standing with the United States. So that's one aspect where you see the costs for him are low.
I'd say that the costs for him perhaps are low, but costs to the country's liberty, for example, are relatively high, because when you've got a country where the power is so centralized, it's inevitable that people are going to take advantage of that power. Whoever it was, some British lord who said that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I think the closer that you get to that, the truer it is. And you're seeing that now where people in Rwanda are, like the opposition parties, are having trouble being heard, right? And is that good for development? I mean, some people say that a benevolent dictator would be like the best type of government for development. So I don't know. I mean, maybe it's not hurting development because clearly Rwanda is developing really quickly, but is it good for the liberty of the people and people who minorities or people who want to be able to talk but can't have their voices heard?
And just to piggyback on this really quickly, so if we look on, it was just the 29th of October, there was a ruling in the lower house of the Rwandan parliament for an amendment that would actually let Paul Kagame run for an additional 7-year term, which would then have him in power potentially into 2034, at which point he'd be in power for about 40 years.
That's insane.
That's 40 years, like including his vice presidency, right?
Right. So since the genocide, so he was a kind of a de facto leader of the country since the end of the genocide. And I mean, this is a trend that you're seeing in a lot of countries recently in Africa, where you have presidents who are unwilling to step down and relinquish control. So it's a big challenge for, the international community also in deciding what their priorities and values are going to be in engaging with these countries.
Absolutely. And I think that because Rwanda has all of this economic drive behind it, I think that part overshadows a lot of the other things right now. So we're kind of seeing a lack of acknowledgement of other issues that play into this.
And especially if we want to look at the United States in particular, President Obama and his administration has really pushed for it has defined U.S.-Africa relations a lot around trade and around partnerships. You see the AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which is really kind of the hallmark of U.S.-Africa trade relations right now. And you see a lot of investment going into both developing the infrastructure and the policy and the trade preferences that will really be able to spur growth and spur trade. So it's hard when, if this country, Rwanda, is rated, it's the second highest rated African country for ease of doing business by the World Bank. And so if it's one of the easiest markets to enter, then why would any government or any corporation who might be lining the pockets of politicians want to sever that relationship?
So that's interesting, because so now we have choices here, right? So either you push for democracy and refuse to cooperate in either a business sense and economic sense with a government that seems to have legitimate problems with human rights issues. I just pulled up Amnesty International's sort of list of issues that they have with the government in Rwanda, and there's quite a few. It's not a small list. So political assassinations abroad, human rights defenders being imprisoned, opposition party members being stifled and imprisoned. The list goes on and on. Journalists being harassed, ending up dead, being imprisoned, being thrown out of the country, etc. So the list goes on and on. But if you refuse to do business with these people, you might be giving up an opportunity to allow the economic growth and the pressure of that growth to foment liberalization in the country that might eventually lead to political liberalization as well.
Yeah, so it sounds like, if you juxtapose those two ideas of, the idea of the human rights abuses along with the economic growth, it seems like, a benevolent democratic government is not necessarily a key to economic development.
I think that Rwanda is a perfect example of that, as we've seen right now. So where does this leave us for the future? Do we see any kind of changes? And I think that this is going to be an interesting thing as we look forward with American and African relations, especially with big economies that we really want to play into. Are we going to see, do we think, a change between the Republican face versus the Democrats' face of how they want to engage in Africa? Will human rights play a priority in this, or do we think we're going to proceed along the status quo with economics being the big factor?
I mean, it's hard to tell with our own domestic politics because, the domestic politics of any country are very complex. Certainly ours are very complex, but we have this added layer of the United States considers it an interest, and in some cases a core interest, that we promote democracy, human rights abroad, right? And this ideally should color the way that we interact with other nations. Now, that doesn't always work, and I won't comment on that for this conversation.
Examples where we don't do that, right?
Right. I'm not going to discuss that here. But this is something that the United States considers very important. It's important in our foreign relations, and it's important in our domestic politics, which fuel our foreign relations, the relationships that we have with other countries, and fuel the way that we spread our influence abroad. So our soft power depends very largely on strategically placed funding and initiatives to encourage democracy and human rights. And freedom of expression and values that we afford ourselves or try to afford ourselves domestically. We generally try to behave internationally in a way that those will spread. So it's hard to say. No matter whether it's Democrats or Republicans in our society, this is a big part of our politics. Is at least asking the question: how are we promoting our values abroad with our donations, even our defense array, etc. So
I don't know if I really see there being many changes. With whoever wins the election in the United States, I think that there will continue to be this kind of small push or maybe a hard push for greater democracy, humanitarianism, but at the same time, given the number of challenges, violent conflicts around Africa and kind of the neighborhood, we see an ongoing peace process that is not, entirely hopeful right now in South Sudan. You have terrorist networks. You have Al-Shabaab in Somalia. You have Boko Haram in Nigeria, and now pushing into Cameroon. You have the Central African Republic. You have all of these issues, and if you have Rwanda here that is doing well and that is kind of a beacon of stability, I think that we will continue to express concern at these humanitarian abuses and restrictions on civil liberties, but I don't really know what the U.S. position would be if there were to be a constitutional change and Kagame stays in power and doesn't necessarily open up freedoms.
Right. It's an interesting question, because how do you react if the people, obviously it doesn't seem like a democratic choice to extend term limits indefinitely, because after a third term, maybe it'll be a fourth and maybe a fifth. And then he could be the next, African leader who's leading for his entire life. But if that's what the people want, then that raises some interesting questions, I think.
I think that's central to the debate. What do the Rwandan people want? And maybe we don't know because he's stifling opposition, but
that's a good point. Yeah.
I have no idea, but I think if the majority of the people do want to see him in power, I don't know. I just, it's an ethical debate.
Yeah. Pushing, maybe it's disingenuous of me to assume voter fraud. In these cases, maybe it isn't.
The track record says otherwise.
The track record would say otherwise. Kagame, both elections that he has won since 2000. He won with more than 90% of the vote. Okay, so if that is actually the case, that's incredible. Now, I'm not sure what kind of opposition he had. This is actually
very fractured opposition.
Very fractured opposition. Okay, so that helps him. But also, he seems to have a lot of support within the country, a lot of domestic support. And this is made more interesting by the fact that the Hutus, so he's a Tutsi, right? And his government is mostly Tutsi. That is the minority group within Rwanda. The majority, I think by 80 or 85%, is the Hutu, right? So if the Hutu are also in support of Kagame's new government, that's telling. That's interesting.
I also don't know how much of a division we want to create here between Hutu and Tutsi. I mean, obviously that was the driver of the Rwandan genocide.
But they were largely arbitrary lines, right?
Yes, I mean, the Hutu-Tutsi divide, the kind of the debate about it, Hutu and Tutsi being ethnic groups or more of kind of socially constructed caste system, are there. So, I mean, yes, so a lot of it was arbitrary and a lot of it was due to colonialism and kind of the divide and conquer tactics that were brought in and imposed. But I don't know, after the genocide, one of Paul Kagame's big pushes has been to eliminate this divide between ethnic groups. So I know, on official documents it isn't listed. I don't think that you're even really allowed to talk about the distinction. So I'm not sure how important that is. I mean,
obviously it's had some repercussions in the past, but if you say there's no true ethnic divide, right, which is scientifically true, but there's still like a social divide where people self-identify, right, as Hutu or Tutsi.
I mean, I think the genocide itself clearly bears that out. I mean, this is enough of a reality for the individuals involved that they will kill each other over it.
So to end, let's talk about what we all think here. I think maybe our discussion has fleshed it out a bit, but also maybe made it a bit more confusing. But what do we think? Chicken or the egg? Democracy or development? Grace, which one do you need first?
Oh, you're putting me on the spot first.
Hate to break it to you.
I don't know. I think the multiple path. I think you have to look. I'm going to take the diplomatic answer.
Very good international relations student.
Very, very context specific. Concluding on this, I think that my overall opinion looking at Rwanda in the future, I think that constitutional term limits are put in place for a reason. So as much as Paul Kagame has done for the growth of Rwanda, I think that when his term comes to an end, I think that should be it. I think that improving democratic freedoms, humanitarianism, I think that's going to be really important. So I think it's necessary.
Drew?
I'll have a similar answer. I think it would depend on the social realities on the ground in the particular state or society in which the development of both democracy and the economy and the society are occurring. I do think, though, that oftentimes the developmental model argument can be used by the strongman, him or herself, to justify never actually getting around to the democratic reforms. So I think there can be a case made in some cases. There can be a case made in some instances where you need a strong man, a strong leader to centralize and marshal resources sort of above the squabble of what can be very messy internally below the surface democratic politics. I do think that type of leadership does not necessarily need to devolve into killing journalists, exiling people, forcing them to return from exile so that you can torture them, harass them, or whatever. And I think that there should be... It's not an easy question to answer, right? And the answer is not easy. It's sort of, one foot in both fires, right? I mean, you have to try to democratize, but maybe you need to delay that in order to develop economically or socially or whatever. But maybe it's like a race with two cars, and one car sort of gets ahead of the other one, and then the second car needs to get ahead of the first car, and the whole race should be borne out that way. Neither of them should be in front the entire time.
Kevin, what do you have for me?
I don't know if I want to say that it depends. If you want to have just like sort of a blanket theory, I would say, there are cases where development can come before democracy and cases where democracies come before development, and both of them have worked and both of them have not worked in some cases. I think what's more important is not the type of governance, although, it's important not to have a government that's, killing journalists, for example, because people won't believe in that. But that said, I think the more important thing, rather than the type of governance, is a leadership in a government that cracks down and prevents corruption. So if you've got rampant corruption, then it's impossible, I think, for true and long-lasting economic development to sustain itself. Obviously, a democracy is what you want in the end, but there are cases where there are dictatorships with developing democracies as well. So I don't think that a democracy is necessary, and I don't think that development will necessarily lead to democracy either.
Well, it was my fault for asking a simple question, and in true fashion, all international affairs students gave me very, very long answers that really didn't answer my question. So thank you all.
We're not lawyers.
Thank you all for joining us this week. For more information and to see the videos and articles we've mentioned, just visit mattersofstate.org. You can also like us or follow us to get our updates. Tune in to us next week. Thanks for listening.
The aggregate of our joy and suffering, thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there, on the mote of dust, suspended in a sunbeam. Think of the rivers of blood spilled by all those generals and emperors, so that in glory and triumph they could become the momentary masters of a fraction of a dot.